A former military nurse stood inside a desert outpost, where silence always came right before bodies disappeared. No one believed she mattered, until a Navy SEAL commander vanished into a kill zone that had erased entire teams before him. They called her just medical support, a spare set of hands, someone to hand out painkillers and change bandages while the real soldiers did the real work. Nobody bothered to ask why she watched the maps the way she did, or why her eyes moved across a mission brief like she was looking for the crack in a dam before it broke. They would find out. By then, it would already be too late for some of them. Before we go further, follow along if you want to see where this one ends up. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The heat at Forward Operating Base Sentinel didn't break at night. It just changed shape, settling into the bones instead of the skin, and Ava Whitmore had stopped fighting it months ago. She'd learned the trick of desert postings the same way she'd learned everything else in 15 years of service. Keep your mouth shut, do the work, and let the men around you assume whatever made them comfortable. She arrived at Sentinel on a transport that smelled like diesel and old sweat, carrying a single duffel bag and a medical kit she'd packed herself, because she didn't trust anyone else to pack it right. The base wasn't much, a scatter of reinforced containers, a comms tower leaning slightly off true, and a perimeter fence that had been patched so many times it looked stitched together. 41 personnel, one understaffed medical tent, and a SEAL detachment that ran the place like it belonged to them. Captain Drew Mallory met her transport personally, which she initially mistook for courtesy. Whitmore. He said her name like he was reading it off a manifest. Tall, sun-cracked, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved for recruiting posters. Heard you're our new combat medic. That's right. You'll be working out of the aid station. Sick call, minor trauma, the occasional heat casualty. He looked her over. Not unkindly, just thoroughly, the way you'd size up a piece of equipment you weren't sure you needed. We don't run a lot of action out of Sentinel, mostly recon support for the teams further north. Understood. You medevaced out of Kandahar in 19, right? Tough rotation. It was. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. After a beat, he nodded like she'd confirmed something he already suspected, that she was quiet because she didn't have much to say, not because she'd already decided he wasn't worth the words. Roe will show you around, Mallory said, gesturing toward a broad-shouldered Master Sergeant leaning against a Humvee with his arms crossed. Master Sergeant Caleb Rowe. He runs logistics, keeps this place from falling apart. Rowe pushed off the Humvee and extended a hand. His grip was firm, his eyes sharper than his easy posture suggested. Welcome to paradise. It's lovely, Ava said. I love the smell. That got the ghost of a smile out of him. Mallory had already turned and walked off, his mind clearly somewhere else, already moving past the new arrival to whatever mattered more. It took less than a week for Ava to understand exactly where she stood in the hierarchy at Sentinel. She wasn't ignored exactly. She was filed. A resource to be accessed when needed and otherwise left alone, the way you'd leave a fire extinguisher hanging on a wall. Useful in theory, invisible in practice. The SEALs ran their own world inside the base. 8 operators under Mallory's command, tight as a fist, talking in half sentences and shorthand that had been built over years of shared deployments. At the center of that world was Commander Marcus Hale, the senior officer overseeing operations out of Sentinel, a man with iron-gray temples and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own judgment in the field. Hale was polite to her. Mallory was professional. The rest of the team mostly didn't register her at all, except when someone needed a blister lanced or a round of antibiotics for a stomach bug that was going around the mess tent. She didn't resent it. She'd spent enough years around operator culture to know how it worked. Trust was earned through shared danger, not job titles, and she hadn't shared danger with any of them yet. What did bother her, the thing that sat under her ribs like a stone she couldn't dislodge, was the way they planned. She first noticed it during a briefing she wasn't technically invited to, but had wandered into anyway, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the particular tension that meant something operational was being decided. Hale was outlining a reconnaissance push into the Kestrel Basin, a stretch of broken terrain 40 kilometers northeast that intelligence had flagged as a possible weapons transfer corridor. We go in at 0400, Hale was saying, tracing a route on the map with his finger. Same window we used for the Tarsus run last month. In, observe, out before first light. Ava stood near the back of the tent, arms crossed, saying nothing. But something in her chest had gone cold and still, the way it always did when she saw a pattern she didn't like. Same window, same entry point, same exfil route as a mission 3 weeks prior. She'd seen this exact mistake before. Watched men die from it, actually, back in a different desert in a different decade, when a unit had used the same routine timing twice in a row, and an enemy with patience had simply waited for them to do it a third time. Patterns got people killed. Predictability was a gift you handed to anyone smart enough to notice. After the briefing broke, she caught Mallory near the equipment racks. "Captain, can I have a minute?" He glanced up, surprised, like the aid station tent had grown legs and walked over to bother him. "Whitmore, what's up?" "The Kestrel Basin mission. I was in the briefing." "You weren't supposed to be, but okay. The timing and route mirror the Tarsus operation almost exactly. If anyone's been watching this base's patterns, that's a problem." Mallory's expression shifted from mild surprise to something more careful, more closed. "We've run that window a dozen times. It works." "That's exactly the issue. It's worked a dozen times, which means anyone paying attention has had a dozen chances to learn it." "With respect," he said, and the word respect did a lot of work to disguise how little of it was actually present. "Intel and mission planning isn't medical. I appreciate you keeping an eye out, but Commander Hale's run more ops in this region than either of us have years of service. He knows what he's doing." "I'm not questioning his experience. I'm questioning a specific tactical pattern." "Noted." He was already turning away. "We've got it handled." She watched him walk off and felt the particular familiar frustration of being technically heard and functionally dismissed. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't, she suspected, be the last. So, the mission launched on schedule, 4 operators slipping out into the pre-dawn dark with Hale at point, moving toward the Kestrel Basin under a sky still thick with stars. Ava watched them go from the edge of the perimeter, arms wrapped around herself against the cold that always preceded the brutal heat of day, and told herself she was wrong. Told herself that experience and rank meant something, that men who had survived a decade of this work knew things she didn't. The radio silence lasted 4 hours before it became its own kind of alarm. Comms checked in every 30 minutes, like clockwork, the way every patrol did. At hour 3, the check-in came late by 6 minutes. Not catastrophic, but enough to make the duty officer glance at the clock twice. At hour 4, there was nothing at all. Ava was in the aid station restocking a trauma kit when Roe burst through the flap, his face already carrying the particular tightness of bad news arriving early. "We've lost contact with Hale's team." "How long?" 40 minutes past last check-in. Mallory's spinning up a QRF. She was already moving, grabbing the go bag she'd packed and repacked every single day since arriving, because some habits from a different life never died. "I'm coming." "Whitmore, this isn't... I'm the only trauma-trained medic on this base who's done dismounted operations, Sergeant. If your QRF finds wounded men in that basin, you're going to need me there, not back here waiting for a helicopter." Roe looked at her for a long second, something recalculating behind his eyes, and then nodded once. "Mallory's call, but I'll back you." Mallory didn't want her on the QRF. That much was obvious from the way his jaw worked when Roe brought it up. But he also didn't have the luxury of refusing a qualified trauma medic when his commanding officer was missing in hostile terrain. He gave her a curt nod, a set of instructions to stay with the support element, and turned away before she could answer. The QRF rolled out 40 minutes later, 4 vehicles cutting through the dark toward the last known position and the desert that had seemed empty and indifferent. An hour before now felt like it was holding its breath. They found the first sign of trouble 2 kilometers from the basin's edge, a scorched patch of ground, spent casings scattered in a pattern that told a story if you knew how to read it. Ava knelt beside the wreckage of what had clearly been a vehicle, now reduced to twisted metal, and felt the cold certainty settle deeper into her chest. "This wasn't insurgents," she said quietly, almost to herself. Mallory crouched beside her, scanning the casings, the blast radius, the precision of the ambush site. "What makes you say that?" "Look at the spacing. The angle of fire. Whoever did this had overlapping fields of view, staggered positions, no wasted shots. She pointed toward the ridge 200 meters out. That's a kill zone. Someone built this specifically for whoever was coming through here at exactly this time. You're saying this was planned for us. I'm saying this was planned for whoever uses this corridor on this schedule, which has been us repeatedly for the last 6 weeks. Mallory's face went pale under the dust and the dim moonlight. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The pattern she'd warned him about that morning had become the reason 4 men were now missing, possibly dead, in the dark. The enemy contact happened 20 minutes later, and it happened fast. The QRF had pushed further into the basin, following a trail of disturbed earth and a single dropped radio that had pinged once before going silent, when the first shots came from the ridgeline, precise, controlled, devastating. Not the wild spray of poorly trained fighters, but disciplined, 3-round bursts that found cover and pinned the convoy down within seconds. "Contact left! Contact left!" Someone was shouting, and then the world dissolved into noise, return fire, the metallic punch of rounds against vehicle armor, the particular high whine of a sniper round passing close enough to feel. Ava was already moving, low and fast, toward the nearest cover, her training overriding the fear that any sane person would feel in that moment. A young operator named Briggs went down 20 feet from her position, clutching his thigh, blood already darkening through his fingers. "Stay with me," she said, sliding in beside him, hands already working, fingers finding the wound with the kind of speed that only came from doing this exact motion hundreds of times before. "You're going to be fine. Look at me, not the leg." "It hurts like hell, ma'am." "I know. That's how you know you're still alive." She tightened the tourniquet, watched the bleeding slow, kept her voice level even as rounds chewed up the dirt 15 feet away. "Eyes on me, soldier. Breathe." The fight lasted 11 more minutes before the attackers broke contact and melted back into the terrain, not retreating in panic, but withdrawing with the same discipline they'd shown in the ambush. A professional force that had accomplished what it came to do and saw no reason to linger. When the dust settled, the math was brutal. 2 QRF members wounded, 1 critically. And Hale's original 4-man team was gone entirely. No bodies, no equipment, no trace beyond the wreckage, and a scattering of spent brass that told a story everyone now understood too well. "They took them," Mallory said, staring at the empty ground where his commanding officer had last stood. His voice had lost every trace of the easy authority from that morning. "They didn't kill them on sight. They took them." The next 36 hours moved like a fever. Intelligence assets scrambled. Satellite passes were rerouted. A grainy thermal image eventually surfaced, showing a compound roughly 18 kilometers from the ambush site, heavily fortified, with movement patterns consistent with a holding facility rather than a forward operating position. Hale and his 3 remaining men, Petrov, Donnelly, and a young intelligence officer named Marsh, were presumed alive, but barely, and the clock attached to that word presumed was ticking faster than anyone wanted to admit. A name surfaced during the intelligence review that made the entire command structure go quiet. Viktor Sokolov. Former Spetsnaz, now operating as a contracted extraction specialist for groups willing to pay premium rates for precision violence. His signature, coordinated ambush, minimal casualties on the capturing side, prisoners taken rather than killed, matched the Kestrel Basin attack with uncomfortable precision. "This isn't a rescue situation anymore," the regional intelligence liaison said over a crackling satellite link, his voice flattened by distance and bad news. "Sokolov doesn't take prisoners for ransom. He takes them for information. And once he's extracted what he needs, he disposes of the asset. You have a window, and it's closing." "How long," Mallory asked, "is the window?" 48 hours, maybe less. The room absorbed that number like a physical blow. What followed was the kind of military bureaucracy that Ava had watched destroy more operations than enemy fire ever had. Command structures arguing over jurisdiction, risk assessments weighed against political consequences, a rescue plan drafted and then quietly shelved because the casualty projections made someone several pay grades above Sentinel nervous about authorizing it. She sat in the back of 3 separate planning sessions and watched good men talk themselves into doing nothing, dressed up as caution. We don't have the assets to mount a direct assault on a fortified position without significant air support, Mallory was saying during the third meeting, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. And air support means a footprint we don't have authorization for in this sector. So what's the plan? Rowe asked. The plan is we wait for authorization to come through proper channels. Proper channels, Ava said quietly. Take time Hale doesn't have. Every head in the tent turned toward her. She hadn't meant to speak. She'd been telling herself for 2 days to stay in her lane, do her job, let the operators handle the operating, but something in her had finally cracked under the weight of watching men with stars and bars on their collars choose paperwork over a man's life. With respect, Whitmore, Mallory said, and there was real exhaustion in it this time, not condescension. This isn't something a medic can weigh in on. I'm not weighing in on tactics. I'm telling you the timeline you're discussing doesn't survive contact with reality. She stood, feeling every eye in the tent on her, feeling the old instinct to shrink back, battling against something harder and colder that had been building in her for days. Sokolov extracts information and disposes of assets. That's not a guess, that's his pattern, confirmed by your own intelligence brief. You're talking about authorization timelines measured in days for a man who has hours. And what would you have us do? Walk in there ourselves? The silence after that question stretched long enough that it stopped being rhetorical. If that's what it takes, Ava said, then yes. Mallory actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound with no real humor in it. You're a combat medic. I'm a lot of things you don't know about, Captain. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, sharper than she usually allowed herself, and she watched something flicker across Mallory's face. Not quite suspicion, not quite recognition, but the first crack in an assumption he'd been carrying since the moment she stepped off that transport. She found Rowe afterward sitting alone outside the comms tent, staring at nothing in particular. You meant that, he said without turning to look at her. In there. You meant you'd go in yourself. I did. You understand what you're describing isn't a medical extraction. That's an infiltration into a fortified hostile compound, alone, against an enemy with documented Spetsnaz training. I understand exactly what I'm describing. Rowe finally turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a recalibration, slow and careful, like a man double-checking a measurement he'd been certain of a moment ago. Whitmore, who are you actually? I'm the medic assigned to this base. That's the file answer. I'm asking the real one. She held his gaze for a long moment, weighing things she'd kept buried for longer than she liked to admit. A different name on different paperwork, training that didn't appear on any roster Mallory had access to, a decade of work that officially didn't exist. Some doors, she said finally, only open from the inside. I need you to trust me without all the details, Caleb. Can you do that? He studied her for another long beat. Then he exhaled, slow, and something in his posture shifted. Not quite belief, but something adjacent to it. What do you need? A vehicle to the perimeter's edge, comms gear that isn't logged anywhere official, and 40 minutes before anyone notices I'm gone. Mallory's going to lose his mind. Mallory doesn't need to know until it's already done. Rowe was quiet for a long moment, and Ava watched him weigh loyalty against loyalty, his chain of command against the cold math of a 48-hour clock that was already past its halfway point. There's something you're not telling me, he said finally, about what you actually did before you ended up here changing bandages. There's a lot I'm not telling you. That's supposed to make me feel better about helping you walk into Sokolov's backyard alone? No, Ava said. It's supposed to make you understand that I've walked into places like that before. And I came back. Something settled in his face. Not certainty, but the particular trust of a soldier who'd learned to read the difference between bravado and competence. 40 minutes, he said. After that, I'm telling Mallory, and God help us both. 40 minutes is more than I need, Wampt. The desert at night had a texture to it that most people never learned to read. The way sound carried differently across open ground, the way certain shadows held shape longer than others, because something was casting them that wasn't supposed to be there. Ava moved through it like she'd been born to it, every sense calibrated to a frequency she hadn't operated on in years, but had never actually forgotten. The compound came into view 2 hours before dawn, exactly where the thermal imagery had placed it. A low cluster of reinforced structures behind a double perimeter fence, guard towers at irregular intervals, the kind of fortification built by someone who understood that predictable patterns got people killed. Sokolov, whatever else he was, didn't make the same mistake Mallory's team had made. She counted 6 visible guards on her first pass, moving with the patient, unhurried discipline of trained personnel rather than hired muscle. A 7th position, elevated, almost certainly held a sniper with overlapping coverage on the main approach. It took her 40 minutes to find him, a slight irregularity in the shadow pattern along the northern ridge, a stillness too perfect to be natural. She closed the distance on her stomach, inch by patient inch, until she was close enough to see the rise and fall of his breathing through the scope of her own rifle. The shot, when it came, was quiet, a suppressed round that dropped him without a sound carrying back to the compound below. She moved to the next position before his absence could register as anything more than a gap in a radio check that hadn't happened yet. By the time the eastern sky had begun its first faint bleed toward gray, 4 of the 7 guards she'd identified were down, and the compound's perimeter had a hole in it the size of a person, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning exactly how these things worked. She slipped through it without a sound. Inside, the compound smelled like diesel and old concrete, fluorescent lights buzzing in a corridor that hadn't seen daylight in longer than it should have. She moved through it the way she'd moved through buildings just like it a decade ago, in a different country, under a different name, before the part of her life that didn't exist on paper had quietly ended, and the part that did, Nurse Ava Whitmore, combat medic, had begun. 2 guards came around a corner together, weapons raised but not expecting contact, and she dropped them both before either could process what was happening. The close quarters violence efficient and silent in a way that would have shocked everyone back at Sentinel, who thought of her as the woman who handed out cold medicine. A 3rd guard got a shot off before she put him down. A single round that punched through drywall 6 inches from her shoulder, the sound of it sharp and final in the enclosed space. An alarm now triggered somewhere she couldn't see. She didn't have the luxury of stealth anymore. She found Hale in the 3rd room she checked, chained to a support beam, his face a mess of bruising, one eye swollen nearly shut. Donnelly was beside him, unconscious or close to it. Petrov was gone. She'd find out later, in a debrief that would haunt her for longer than she expected, that he hadn't survived the first night of questioning. "Whitmore?" Hale's voice was a ruin, barely recognizable. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving your life, Commander. Try not to make this harder than it needs to be." She had the chains off him in under a minute, her hands already assessing the damage as she worked. 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder she'd need to address before he could move properly, dehydration severe enough to be its own emergency. She popped the shoulder back into place with a brutal, practiced motion that made him gasp and curse in the same breath. "We need to move," she said, already pulling Donnelly's arm over her shoulders. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." He didn't sound entirely certain of that, but he was already trying. The alarm had become a siren now, klaxons echoing through the compound's corridors, and Ava could hear boots moving fast in multiple directions, the sound of a hornet's nest that had just been violently disturbed. "Whoever you really are," Hale said, limping beside her, one arm braced against the wall. "You picked a hell of a time to show your hand." "I picked the only time that mattered," she said. "Now move." The breakout through the compound was the kind of violence that Ava had spent years trying not to think about. Not because she regretted it, but because dwelling on it served no purpose beyond the moment it was needed. She cleared 2 more corridors with Donnelly slung over her shoulder and Hale limping at her side, putting down anyone who stood between them and the gap in the perimeter fence, moving with a focus so total that the explosion starting to rip through the compound's eastern wing barely registered as anything more than background noise. Rose's voice crackled through the earpiece she'd kept hidden through the entire infiltration. "Whitmore, talk to me. We've got drone feed showing the compound lighting up like a Christmas tree. Hale's alive, Donnelly's alive. We're moving to the extraction point." "Copy that. QRF is 20 minutes out. Hot." "We might not have 20 minutes." She wasn't wrong. The exit, when they reached it, wasn't clean. A figure was waiting near the breach in the fence, tall and still, holding himself with the particular economy of motion that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime being dangerous and saw no reason to advertise it now. Sokolov. You should not have come back through here, he said, his accent flattening the words into something almost gentle, almost reasonable, as if he were offering practical advice rather than a threat. I would have given you the chance to leave. I'm not leaving without him. Then we have a problem. The fight that followed was nothing like the controlled efficiency she'd shown clearing the corridors. Sokolov was fast, precise, trained in a tradition that matched hers blow for blow, and within seconds she understood that this was a fight she could lose. He caught her across the jaw hard enough to drop her to one knee, and she tasted copper, felt the world tilt sideways for a fraction of a second that nearly cost her everything. That fraction of a second was almost enough. It was Hale. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, barely able to stand. Who made the difference? Refusing to be dead weight 1 second longer, he wrenched a sidearm from a fallen guard near the fence line and put a round into Sokolov's leg at the exact moment the man raised his blade for what would have been the finishing strike. Sokolov staggered, and the half-second of imbalance was all Ava needed. She drove forward, disarmed him with a brutal economy of motion, and put him down hard against the dirt, her knee against his throat. The fight, finally, suddenly over. Mistake, Sokolov managed, blood in his teeth, something almost like respect in his ruined voice. Should have killed you both. You had your chance, Ava said, and didn't loosen her grip until the QRF's headlights crested the ridge behind them. The QRF's headlights swept across the breach in the fence like a verdict, and for one suspended second, nobody moved. Not the wounded men slumped against the dirt, not Sokolov bleeding out under Ava's knee, not the soldiers piling out of the vehicles with weapons raised at a scene that didn't match anything in their briefing. Then Rowe was there, shouting orders, and the moment broke apart into motion. Zip tie him, Ava said, rising off Sokolov's throat but keeping a boot planted on his wounded leg. He doesn't get a clean death. He gets a cell and an interrogation room. Copy that. One of the QRF operators, a young corporal named Huto, dropped to secure Sokolov's wrists with a kind of nervous efficiency, like he wasn't sure whether the woman giving orders outranked him or not. Nobody had told him. Nobody had told anybody anything yet. Hale was on the ground, propped against the wheel well of the lead vehicle, and Ava was beside him before the medics could even unload their kits, her hands already working through a faster, more thorough assessment than the brief one she'd managed inside the compound. Cracked ribs, confirmed dislocation now relocated but inflamed, severe dehydration, the beginnings of a fever that worried her more than the visible wounds. You're going to feel worse before you feel better, she told him, sliding a line into his arm with the kind of speed that made the watching medics go quiet. That's normal. Don't let it scare you. Nothing about the last 48 hours has been normal, Hale said, his voice a wreck, but there was something almost like humor underneath it. The particular dark humor of a man who'd survived something he hadn't expected to. Welcome to the rest of your life, Commander. Donnelly was loaded onto a second vehicle, stable but barely conscious, and the convoy turned back toward Sentinel with Sokolov bound and silent in the rear compartment, blood seeping through a hasty field dressing on his leg. Behind them, the compound burned against the lightening sky. Secondary explosions still cracking through the structure as whatever weapons cache Sokolov had been running finally cooked off in the heat. Mallory was waiting at the perimeter when they rolled in, and the look on his face when he saw Ava climb out of the lead vehicle, unhurt, blood that wasn't hers crusted along her jaw, moving with the loose, dangerous ease of someone who had just done violence and set it down without ceremony, was not the look of a man confirming what he already suspected. It was the look of a man whose entire understanding of the last 3 weeks had just been quietly rewritten. Whitmore. He said her name slower this time. You want to explain what just happened? I went and got your commander back. That's what happened. Alone. Rowe knew. Mallory's head turned toward Rowe with a speed that made the master sergeant straighten without quite meaning to. You knew. I knew she was going, sir. I didn't know how, and I sure as hell didn't ask, because the alternative was Commander Hale dying on Sokolov's table while we waited on a satellite phone for permission that wasn't coming in time. For a moment it looked like Mallory might actually say something to that, might let the anger out into the open air where everyone could see it, but then his eyes dropped to Hale, barely conscious on a stretcher being carried past, and whatever he'd been about to say curdled into something quieter. Get him to medical, Mallory said instead. All of you. We'll sort the rest of this out later. Later came faster than anyone wanted. By the time the sun was fully up, Sentinel had transformed from a sleepy reconnaissance outpost into something closer to a crime scene, with personnel from 3 different commands suddenly very interested in a base that had spent the last several months operating well below anyone's notice. A secured line had been opened to the regional intelligence liaison within the hour, and the conversation that followed happened in Mallory's command tent with the flaps zipped shut, though half the base could still hear his voice rising and falling through the canvas. Ava wasn't in the room for that conversation. She was in the aid station, finishing the work she'd started in the field, stabilizing Hale, monitoring Donnelly, cleaning and dressing the various cuts and bruises that came from a night spent doing things her file didn't say she could do. Sokolov sat under armed guard in a converted shipping container that had become, for the moment, the nearest thing Sentinel had to a holding cell, his leg wound stitched closed by a medic who'd been ordered not to ask questions and hadn't. She'd just finished checking Donnelly's vitals when Rowe ducked into the tent, his expression carrying the particular weight of a man who'd spent the last hour listening to people far above his pay grade argue about things he didn't have the clearance to fully understand. "They're pulling your file," he said quietly, glancing toward the cot where Hale lay sleeping, finally, under sedation. "Real file. Not the one that got you assigned here." "I figured they would." "You don't seem worried about that." "I'm not." She straightened, wiping her hands on a clean cloth, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the desert. "Caleb, I trusted you with my life out there. I'm going to trust you with this too, because you've earned it, and because it's going to come out anyway in about an hour. I spent 6 years attached to a classified joint operations program. Combat medicine was the official designation. What I actually did covered more ground than that." "How much more ground?" "Enough that the program doesn't technically exist anymore, on paper. Enough that what you saw me do last night wasn't an aberration. It was Tuesday." Rowe absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blow he'd been bracing for but still hadn't fully expected. "And Mallory's going to find that out in the next hour. Mallory's going to find out exactly as much as command clears him to know, which might be everything, might be nothing. That's never been my call. Does it bother you, spending 3 weeks being treated like furniture by a guy who's about to get a briefing telling him you could have ended his entire team in under a minute if you'd wanted to?" Ava considered the question longer than Rowe probably expected. "It used to bother me more. You learn eventually that the people who underestimate you aren't doing it because they're cruel. They're doing it because the story they've been told about who matters and who doesn't is the only story they've ever had to test. Mallory wasn't wrong to assume things about a quiet woman who showed up with a medical kit. He was wrong about which assumptions to make. That's a generous way to look at being invisible for 3 weeks. It's not generous, it's just true. And it stopped mattering the second Hale needed someone who could actually go get him. The summons came an hour later, delivered by a young communications specialist who looked deeply uncomfortable about being the one to deliver it. Captain Mallory wanted to see her. Command tent. Now. She found him standing behind his field desk, a tablet open in front of him displaying a document with more black redaction bars than visible text, his face carrying an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger. Not quite. Something closer to a man recalculating every conversation he'd ever had. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "I'd rather you sit down, Whitmore." She sat. He didn't, choosing instead to pace a short, restless line behind the desk, the tablet still glowing in his peripheral vision like something he couldn't quite stop glancing at. "I just got off a call with people 3 levels above anyone I usually talk to," he said. "They confirmed your service record. The real one. The one that doesn't show up when I run your name through standard channels." He stopped pacing, looked at her directly. 6 years with a Joint Special Operations Medical Unit. Survival rate on extractions involving your unit's personnel, 94%, against an operational average across comparable programs of 61. You've got combat decorations I'm not cleared to read the citations for. That sounds about right. That sounds about right. He repeated it back to her like the words tasted strange in his mouth. 3 weeks, Whitmore. 3 weeks you sat in my aid station handing out salt tabs and letting me think you were exactly what your cover said you were. That was the point of the cover. Why Sentinel? Why a reassignment to a backwater recon post if you're... He gestured vaguely at the tablet, at the redacted document, at the entire shape of what he'd just learned. Whatever the hell you actually are. She held his gaze. Because programs like the one I served in don't end cleanly, Captain. They get quietly shut down, and the people who ran them get quietly reassigned somewhere boring, where nobody asks questions while the paperwork sorts itself out. I came to Sentinel because Sentinel was supposed to be nowhere. Nothing was supposed to happen here. And then Hale's team walked into an ambush built by a former Spetsnaz extraction specialist. And then that. Mallory sat down finally, heavily, like the conversation had taken something out of him that he hadn't expected to spend. I dismissed you. 3 separate times, I had you standing in front of me telling me something was wrong, and 3 separate times I told you to stay in your lane. You did. I'm not going to pretend that's easy to sit with. I'm not asking you to enjoy it, Captain. I'm asking you to do better with the next person who tells you something you don't want to hear. She stood, smoothing down the front of her uniform, the conversation having reached the point where nothing more needed saying. That's the only apology that actually matters to me. Word moved through a base like Sentinel the way fire moves through dry brush. Fast, total, impossible to contain once it started. By midday, every operator on the base had heard some version of the story, most of it wildly exaggerated, a few details somehow more restrained than the truth actually was. The woman who handed out cold medicine had gone into Sokolov's compound alone and walked Commander Hale back out through a firefight. Some versions had her killing a dozen men. The real number was lower, but not by enough to change how anyone looked at her now. The shift in how the SEALs treated her happened almost immediately, and it made her uncomfortable in a way the previous 3 weeks of dismissal never had. Men who'd walked past her without a second glance now nodded when she crossed the compound. Someone, she never found out who, left a fresh pot of coffee outside the aid station every morning for the rest of the week, an offering that said more than any conversation could have. Donnelly, recovering in the aid station with a feeding tube and an IV line, and the particular hollow-eyed look of a man who'd spent 2 days expecting to die, reached out and caught her wrist as she checked his vitals that afternoon. "Petrov," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "Did you find anything about Petrov?" Ava's hand stilled. She'd been bracing for this question since the compound, dreading it the way she dreaded every conversation that required her to deliver a truth nobody wanted. "He didn't make it, Donnelly. I'm sorry." Donnelly's face didn't crumple the way she expected. Instead, it went very still, very flat, the particular stillness of a man putting something heavy down, somewhere he could pick it up again later, when there was time to actually feel it. "He had a kid, back home, 5 years old." "I know." "You know?" "Hale told me in the compound before we got out. He wanted Petrov's family to know he didn't break. Didn't give them anything, even at the end." Donnelly's eyes went wet, and he turned his face toward the canvas ceiling of the tent, blinking hard, and Ava sat with him in silence for a while, because some things didn't need a medic's intervention. They just needed someone willing to sit in the wreckage with you until you were ready to stand back up. Sokolov, under guard in the converted shipping container, had said almost nothing since his capture. Not to the intelligence officers who'd flown in within hours of the news breaking, not to the interrogators who'd tried every angle their training offered. He sat with the particular patience of a man who'd been trained to expect this exact situation and had long ago decided how he would handle it. He spoke finally only when Ava came to check the wound on his leg, the one stitched closed by a medic following her instructions, because Mallory had insisted that whatever else happened, Sokolov's medical needs would be handled properly. Some lines, even out here, didn't get crossed. "You are better than I expected," Sokolov said, watching her change the dressing with the same clinical detachment he might have used to discuss weather. "I have fought many operators in many places. Few of them were women allowed to call themselves nurses on paperwork. You talk a lot for a man with nothing useful to say. I am saying something useful. I am telling you this is not finished. The people who hired me for this extraction will not be pleased that it failed." Ava's hands didn't pause in their work, but something in her went very alert, very focused. "Who hired you, Sokolov? That information is worth more than the conversation we are having right now. You're sitting in a shipping container with a bullet wound and an interrogation scheduled for tomorrow morning. I'd reconsider what you think your information is worth." He smiled, thin and humorless. I will tell your people what I choose to tell them when I choose to tell them. But I will tell you this for free, nurse, because I respect what you did last night, even as I intend to escape the consequences of it." He leaned forward slightly, the chain on his restraints pulling taut. "This was never only about Commander Hale. The reconnaissance corridor you disrupted, Tarsus, Kestrel Basin, the route your SEALs have been running for 6 weeks. It was never random surveillance. Someone wanted to know exactly what your people had identified along that corridor, and I was paid very well to ensure they did not report it." The dressing finished, Ava straightened, looking down at him with the particular stillness that meant she was filing every word away for later use. "What was along that corridor, Sokolov?" "That," he said, settling back, "is a question for someone with more authority than either of us." That night, alone in the small private space afforded to her in the medical tent, Ava finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what the last 48 hours had cost. Not regret exactly, but the particular exhaustion that came after sustained adrenaline finally drained away and left nothing behind but the body's bill for everything it had been asked to do. Her hands, steady through the entire infiltration, the firefight, the surgical work afterward, finally shook for 10 full minutes before settling. She thought about Petrov, a man she'd never met alive, whose death she now carried the way she carried all the others, filed away in the part of her that never quite stopped counting. She thought about Sokolov's words. This was never only about Hale, and the particular dread that came from realizing a mission you'd thought was finished might only have been the surface of something larger. A soft knock interrupted the thought. Rowe, standing at the entrance with 2 mugs of something that was technically coffee, though Sentinel's coffee had long since stopped resembling the genuine article. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing one over. "Thank you." He sat without being asked, settling into the folding chair across from her cot, and for a while neither of them said anything, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised her, given how little time they'd actually known each other. "Sokolov say anything useful?" Rowe asked eventually. "He said the ambush wasn't only about Hale. Said someone wanted to know what your reconnaissance had identified along that corridor." Rowe's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet, but I don't like the shape of it." "You think someone inside command—" "I think," Ava said carefully, "that a Spetsnaz extraction specialist doesn't get hired on a whim, and the people who hired him wanted information specific enough to be worth losing 4 operators to keep buried. That's not random insurgent activity. That's someone protecting something." Rowe was quiet for a long moment, turning his mug slowly between his hands. "You ever get tired of being right about things nobody wants to hear?" "Every single day." He almost smiled at that, the expression flickering and then settling into something more serious. "For what it's worth, Whitmore, I should have pushed Mallory harder those first few weeks. Should have trusted my own read on you instead of just letting the file speak for itself. You backed me when it mattered. That's more than most people manage." "Doesn't feel like enough." "It rarely does," she said. "That's the job." The intelligence team arrived in full force the following morning, a 6-person unit flown in on a transport that kicked up a dust storm visible from half a mile out, led by a sharp-eyed analyst named Director Wren, who carried herself with the particular brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent her career cleaning up other people's catastrophic failures. She set up shop in the command tent, commandeered every piece of intelligence Sentinel had gathered over the past 6 weeks, and requested, not asked, requested in the tone that made clear it wasn't optional, a full debrief from Ava regarding everything Sokolov had said. "He mentioned the corridor specifically," Wren said, reviewing her notes with the kind of focus that suggested she was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "Said someone wanted to know what your reconnaissance had identified." Those were close to his exact words, yes. "And you have no theory as to what that might be?" "I have a theory I don't like very much," Ava said. 6 weeks of reconnaissance along a single corridor, repeated enough times that an outside party could predict the timing precisely. That's not casual interest. Someone was tracking what your people were finding. Wren made a note, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone trained not to let her face give away how much a piece of information actually mattered. "We pulled satellite data from the corridor going back 2 months. There's a structure roughly 6 kilometers east of the Kestrel Basin that doesn't appear on any registered facility map for this region. Unregistered, unmarked, built within the last year according to construction timeline analysis. What kind of structure? That, Wren said, is what we're about to find out. And given everything that's happened, I'd like your unit involved in confirming it. Commander Hale's out of commission for at least 2 weeks. Captain Mallory's team is short 3 operators. You're the only person on this base who's actually proven capable of operating inside a hostile facility and coming back out with everyone alive. The room went very quiet. Ava felt Mallory's eyes on her from across the tent, watched the particular shift in his expression as the woman he'd dismissed for 3 weeks was formally, officially asked to lead where he could not. You want me running point on this? I want you running point on this, Wren confirmed. Captain Mallory will provide operational support. But given your record, and given that Sokolov specifically chose to share information with you rather than my interrogators, I think you've already earned more trust on this corridor than anyone else currently standing in this tent. Mallory's jaw worked once, visibly, and then he nodded, a short, clipped gesture that cost him something to make. She's right. Whitmore leads. It was, Ava thought, the most honest thing Captain Drew Mallory had said to her since the day she arrived. The unregistered structure showed up clean on the next satellite pass, a low, sprawling facility half buried into a hillside, designed with the specific intention of evading exactly the kind of casual aerial reconnaissance that had been sweeping the region for months. Wren's team flagged it as a probable signals intelligence node, possibly tied to a larger network monitoring US, an allied movement throughout the corridor, though the analysis came with enough hedging language that it was clear nobody was fully certain yet. What was certain was the timeline. Whatever the facility's purpose, its operators now knew their extraction specialist had failed, knew Sokolov was in custody, and knew, or would very soon know, that the secret they'd paid to protect was actively being unraveled by people with satellites and patience. They'll move, Ava said, studying the imagery laid out across the command tent's central table. Whatever's in that facility, whatever they're protecting, if they think we're closing in, they'll either reinforce it or they'll burn it down and disappear before we get there. Which means we don't have the luxury of building a slow, careful operation, Wren said. No, we don't. Mallory, standing at the edge of the table with his arms crossed, looked between the two women with an expression that suggested he was still adjusting to a world where he wasn't the one making this particular call. How fast are we talking? 48 hours, Ava said. Maybe less if Sokolov's employers are as professional as he is. And if we move and we're wrong about what's in there, then we've wasted a strike package on an empty building, Wren said. And if we don't move and we're right, we lose whatever's inside before we ever get a chance to find out what it cost 4 men their lives to protect. The decision, when it came fast. Faster than Ava expected, given the bureaucratic paralysis she'd watched strangle the Hale rescue for nearly 2 full days. Whatever Sokolov's capture had changed in the regional command structure, it had apparently shaken loose the kind of urgency that authorization timelines usually swallowed whole. By that evening, a strike package had been authorized. Limited air support, a 12-person assault element, and Ava Whitmore listed as operational lead for the ground infiltration, a designation that 3 days earlier would have been unthinkable to every single person now reading it on a mission brief. Mallory found her that night near the perimeter fence, watching the dark line of the desert where the unregistered facility waited, 6 kilometers and an entire reckoning away. You don't have to lead this, he said. Wren could put one of her own people in that slot. You've already done more than anyone could have asked. I know I don't have to. Then why are you? She considered the question longer than she usually allowed herself to consider anything, weighing the honest answer against the easier one. Because 4 men walked into that corridor, because nobody listened to a warning that came from someone they'd already decided didn't matter. Petrov's dead because of that. I'm not interested in watching it happen again because the next person with a useful read on the situation gets dismissed the same way. Mallory was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the same dark horizon she'd been watching. For what it's worth, he said finally, I take you over anyone else I've worked with in 15 years of this job. I should have seen that 3 weeks ago. I'm telling you now instead. 3 weeks ago wouldn't have changed anything that's already happened. No, but it might change what happens next. He glanced at her, something steadier in his expression than she'd seen since the Night Hale's team disappeared. "Whatever's in that facility, Whitmore, you're not walking in there alone this time. That much, I can promise you." She nodded, and for the first time since arriving at Sentinel, the silence between them felt like something closer to an actual partnership instead of a polite, careful distance. The strike package launched at 0300 under a moonless sky, 12 operators and 1 combat medic, whose name didn't appear correctly on half the official paperwork, moving in coordinated formation toward a facility that had cost 4 men their freedom and one of them his life. 6 kilometers out, the lead helicopter's pilot came over the commnet with a voice gone suddenly tight and careful. "We've got movement at the target site. Multiple vehicles, heat signatures consistent with rapid loadout. They're not reinforcing." "They're running," Ava said, already feeling the cold certainty settle back into her chest. The same instinct that had warned her about Kestrel Basin now screaming something far worse. "They know we're coming, and they're not planning to leave anything behind for us to find." The pilot's voice came back grim, the helicopter's engines roaring louder as it banked hard toward the facility. "ETA 4 minutes. If they're burning evidence, we're not going to make it in time to stop them." Below, against the dark hillside, the first flicker of orange bloomed against the unregistered structure's walls. Fire, deliberate and fast-spreading, the unmistakable signature of a demolition charge designed to erase everything before anyone could see what had been hidden there. And in the seconds it took the assault element to process what they were watching, the entire shape of the mission collapsed into something far more desperate than anyone had briefed for. "Put us down short," Ava said into the commnet, already unbuckling her harness as the helicopter banked harder. "If we land on top of that fire, we lose the LZ and half the squad to secondary blasts. Well, negative on short insertion, that terrain's broken rock for 200 meters. Then we run 200 meters. Better than landing in a kill radius." Mallory's voice cut in, flat and final. "Do it." Whitmore's call. The helicopter flared hard over a flat shelf of ground, 300 meters from the burning structure, rotor wash kicking dust into a stinging wall, and the assault element poured out into it 2 by 2, weapons up, moving fast toward the orange glow already chewing through the facility's western wing. Ava hit the ground running, the old rhythm of it coming back instantly. Boots finding purchase on broken rock, lungs burning, the particular tunnel vision focus that blocked out everything except the next 100 feet of ground. The first explosion came when they were still 150 meters out, a concussive thump that rolled across the desert floor and knocked 2 operators sideways. Not the demolition charges inside, something closer, something that hadn't been on any imagery. "IED," someone shouted. "Perimeter seated." "Hold!" Ava's voice cracked across the chaos, command instinct overriding everything else. "Nobody move off the marked line. Step where the man in front of you stepped." It was Sokolov's signature all over again, professional, layered, designed to punish exactly the kind of rushed approach a burning building provoked. Whoever had built this facility's defenses understood that fire created urgency, and urgency made soldiers careless. They picked their way forward in a single tight file, painstaking and slow even as the structure ahead continued to burn, every step a negotiation between speed and survival. Ava felt the seconds bleeding away, felt the certainty that whatever evidence existed inside that building was turning to ash, with every minute they spent moving like they had time they didn't have. They reached the breach point, a blown section of outer wall already collapsing inward, with the fire roaring loud enough to swallow conversation. Smoke poured out in thick black columns, and through gaps in it, Ava could see shapes moving inside, hurried, panicked, the unmistakable silhouettes of people grabbing what they could carry and abandoning the rest. "2 teams," she called out. "Hutto, Briggs, with me. We go for whoever's still inside. Mallory, your element holds the perimeter and watches for anyone trying to break out the far side." "Copy." The interior was a furnace, heat pressing against her skin like a physical weight the moment she crossed the threshold, visibility dropping to almost nothing beyond the orange flicker of flame eating through what looked like server racks and filing cabinets. A deliberate fire, accelerant fed, designed to consume documents and electronics with maximum efficiency. Whoever had run this place had trained for exactly this contingency. A figure broke from a side corridor, sprinting for a rear exit with an armful of hard drives, and Hutto tackled him before he'd gone 10 feet, the two of them crashing into a half-collapsed shelving unit that sent a fresh shower of sparks raining down. "Got one!" Hudo's voice came muffled through smoke and his own coughing. "He's not military, I think he's a contractor, civilian clothes under a tack vest. Cuff him and drag him out. Now, this whole place is going to come down." She pressed deeper, Briggs at her shoulder, scanning rooms through the smoke for anything else worth saving, and found a final room at the structure's core that made her stop cold despite the heat, despite the ceiling groaning above them, despite every instinct screaming that they'd already spent too long inside a building actively trying to kill them. Monitors. A dozen of them, most already melted or smoking, but two still flickering with feeds that hadn't yet succumbed to the fire. Live satellite tracking data, overlaid with markers that traced, unmistakably, the exact movement patterns of U.S. personnel throughout the region for the last several months. Not just Sentinel's reconnaissance corridor, other bases, other patrols. A surveillance operation with a reach far beyond anything anyone had briefed for. "Briggs, get a photo of this now, before it's gone." He raised his phone, the screen catching the orange light, and managed 3 frames before the ceiling above them cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and a support beam came down across the doorway they'd entered through, sealing it in a cascade of burning debris. "We're cut off," Briggs said, and for the first time his voice carried real fear instead of adrenaline. Ava didn't waste time on the blocked exit. She was already moving, eyes scanning the smoke-choked room for any alternative, any seam in the structure that hadn't yet caught fire. "There's a ventilation shaft, southeast corner. I saw it on the way in. Move." The shaft was narrow, hot enough to burn skin through fabric, and Briggs went first, his larger frame barely clearing the gap, Ava pushing him from behind as the heat behind them climbed toward something that would stop being survivable within minutes. They emerged into open air on the structure's far side, lungs raw, coughing black soot, just as the building's main section collapsed inward with a roar that sent a shockwave of heat rolling across the desert floor. "Whitmore! Briggs!" Mallory's voice, real panic in it now, cutting through the calm chaos. "Say status!" "We're out. We're clear. Briggs is burned, not critical. We got photos before the room went." "Photos of what?" "Something a lot bigger than a signals node," Ava said, dragging Briggs further from the heat, already assessing the burns along his forearm with clinical speed, even as her mind raced through the implications of what she'd just seen. "Captain, this wasn't local. This was tracking U.S. movement across multiple bases. We need that contractor alive and talking, because whatever this operation actually is, it didn't end with Sokolov in a cell." The contractor, a wiry man in his 40s who gave his name only as Reyes and nothing else, sat zip-tied against a vehicle's wheel well 20 minutes later, watching the facility burn down to its foundation with an expression that had moved past fear into something closer to resignation. He'd lost the hard drives in the chaos of his capture, but the photos Briggs had taken were enough to confirm what Ava already suspected. "You understand," she told him, crouching to his eye level while a medic worked on Briggs's burns nearby, "that the people who built this facility just tried to kill their own contractor to keep him quiet. That tells me everything I need to know about how much loyalty you actually owe them." Reyes said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward the burning structure and something in his jaw tightened. "Sokolov's in custody, talking, slowly, but talking. The next 24 hours are going to determine whether you're a footnote in someone else's prosecution or whether you're the man who helped us understand what this actually was. Your call." He was quiet for a long moment, the fire reflected in his eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, scraped raw by smoke. "You don't understand what you've stepped into. This wasn't a local operation. The targeting data, the corridor tracking, that gets sold, routed through contractors, brokered to whoever's paying, military movements packaged and resold to interests that have nothing to do with this region at all." "Sold to who?" "I don't have names. I have a delivery schedule and a handler I've never seen in person." Reyes swallowed hard. "But I can tell you the data already went out twice before tonight. Whatever you're worried about happening next, it might already be happening somewhere else." The radio at Mallory's hip crackled before Ava could press further, an urgent transmission cutting through the channel with the particular tone that meant something else had just gone catastrophically wrong. Wren's voice, tight and fast, barely recognizable from the composed analyst who'd briefed them less than 12 hours earlier. "All units be advised. We have a second facility flagged, 300 kilometers north, and thermal imaging is showing personnel movement consistent with an active strike preparation. If Reyes is right about the data being sold and used operationally, that target isn't a storage site. It's a kill list, and it's about to be executed against a forward element that has no idea it's compromised. Mallory's face went white. Whose element? The pause before Wren answered stretched just long enough for Ava's stomach to drop before the words even arrived. Yours, Captain. The second team you've got rotating through Outpost Corvell. They go dark for routine resupply in under 6 hours, and based on what we're seeing, someone already knows exactly when and where to find them. Outpost Corvell, Mallory repeated, like saying it again might change the answer. That's Lindqvist's team. 6 operators, skeleton support staff. They've got no idea. They will in about 90 seconds because I'm patching you through directly, Wren said. But Captain, you need to understand the math here. Corvell is 300 kilometers north. Even with air assets, you're looking at minimum 90 minutes to get a quick reaction force on the ground there. If the strike prep Reyes is describing is already in motion, 90 minutes might be 90 minutes too many. Ava was already moving toward the comm vehicle, her mind running through the problem the way she'd run through triage 1,000 times. Not what was ideal, but what was possible inside the time they actually had. Wren, can Corvell relocate on their own authority? Pull back from resupply position before the window closes? They can, if someone convinces Lindqvist fast enough that this isn't an abundance of caution. He's not going to abandon a fixed position based on a thermal read from 300 kilometers away without something harder than that. Then give him something harder. Ava grabbed the handset before anyone could stop her, keying into the channel with the same flat authority she'd used clearing the burning facility 20 minutes earlier. Outpost Corvell, this is Whitmore attached to Sentinel Command. Authenticate and listen close, because I'm not going to have time to repeat myself. A pause, then a wary voice crackled back. Authenticate first. Who the hell is Whitmore? I'm the medic who pulled Commander Hale out of a Spetsnaz holding facility 48 hours ago, and the same person who just pulled targeting data out of a burning signals node showing your resupply window flagged for a strike. You can verify all of that through Captain Mallory standing next to me right now, or you can spend the next 6 hours finding out the hard way which one of us was right. Mallory leaned into the handset. Lindqvist, it's Mallory. She's not exaggerating. Move your element off the fixed resupply position. Now, full stop, no further questions. The wait that followed felt longer than it was, the desert wind picking up around the comm vehicle, the burning facility behind them finally starting to collapse into embers rather than open flame. When Lindqvist's voice came back, it had lost the wariness, replaced by the clipped urgency of a man who just decided to trust a stranger's voice over his own scheduled orders. Pulling back now? Where do you want us? Anywhere that isn't where they expect you, Ava said. We'll have a relocation grid to you within 10 minutes. The next hour moved with the particular controlled chaos of a crisis being managed by people who'd finally, belatedly, learned to listen to the right voice in the room. Wren's analysts cross-referenced satellite data to identify a safer staging position for Corvell's element. Mallory coordinated with regional command to scramble air support toward the second facility, the one Wren's team had flagged as active strike preparation rather than passive surveillance. And Ava, blood and soot still drying on her uniform, sat with Reyes and pulled every scrap of useful information out of him that his fear and his self-interest would allow. The handler, she said, for the third time, watching him flinch at the repetition. You said you'd never seen him in person. That doesn't mean you've got nothing. Comms protocol, payment structure, anything. Reyes exhaled, long and unsteady. Burner channel, rotates weekly. But payment routes through a logistics company, civilian contractor, does legitimate work too, which is how they launder the rest of it. Praxis Continental. I've seen the name on invoices. Ava's stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the desert night air. Praxis Continental does logistics support for half the bases in this region, including resupply runs to Corvell. Wren, who'd been listening from across the tent, went very still. If they're inside the supply chain, they're not just selling data, they've got physical access to bases through legitimate cover. Which means whoever's running this isn't watching from outside, Ava said. They're walking through the front gate with a clipboard and a badge. The implications of that settled over the tent like a physical weight. Mallory's face had gone hard. The particular hardness of a man realizing that an enemy he'd been hunting in the desert had actually been standing inside his own perimeter the entire time, disguised as routine and boring and trusted. Pull every Praxis Continental contractor currently on base, Mallory said, already moving toward the tent flap. Every single one right now, full ID verification. Captain, Ava's voice stopped him. If there's someone inside that company actively feeding targeting data, the second they see a sweep happening, they'll either run or they'll burn whatever evidence they're carrying. You don't sweep loud. You sweep quiet, and you watch who reacts. Mallory turned back, jaw tight, weighing the instinct to act immediately against the cold logic of what she was saying. 3 weeks ago, he wouldn't have hesitated to override her. Now he stood in the doorway of his own command tent and actually considered it. Fine, he said finally. Quiet sweep. You're running it. The quiet sweep took 2 hours, conducted under the cover of a routine equipment audit that gave Mallory's people a reason to move through every section of the base without raising alarm. 6 Praxis Continental personnel currently rotated through Sentinel in various support capacities. 2 logistics coordinators, a communications technician, 3 drivers handling the resupply runs between outposts. Ava watched the technician first, a quiet man named Foster, who'd been on base for 11 days and kept his comms equipment in a state of obsessive order that struck her as either professional pride or something closer to nervous control. He answered routine questions about his work history without hesitation, his hands steady, his eyes meeting hers, without the particular flicker of evasion she'd learned to read over years of doing exactly this kind of work. Not him. The second logistics coordinator, a heavy-set man named Drummond, who'd transferred in 2 months earlier from a different regional posting, gave her almost nothing to work with. Competent answers, appropriate eye contact, the bored efficiency of a man who'd answered the same kind of questions a dozen times before in a dozen different audits. It was the third driver, a younger man introduced as Petrosky, whose composure cracked first, not dramatically, not in any way that would have registered to someone less practiced at reading people under pressure, but enough. A half-second delay before answering a question about his last 3 resupply routes. A glance toward the tent exit that lasted a fraction too long. Hands that wanted to move and were being deliberately, visibly restrained. Your last run to Corvell, Ava said, keeping her tone perfectly level, perfectly bored, the same tone she'd use asking about a minor medical complaint. What was the cargo manifest? Standard resupply, water, MREs, ammunition allocation, comms parts. Comms parts. From Foster's requisition or routed separately? The half-second delay again, longer this time. I'd have to check the manifest. You drove the truck. You don't remember what was in it? I don't memorize every line item, ma'am. I just drive the route. Ava let the silence sit for a moment, watching him not look at her, watching the particular stillness of a man trying very hard to appear relaxed. That's interesting, she said finally, because the comms parts requisition for that run wasn't filed by Foster. It wasn't filed by anyone we can identify yet. It just appeared on the manifest 2 hours before your truck left the gate. Petrosky's face didn't change much, but his hand, resting on his knee, closed into a fist and then deliberately, visibly, relaxed again. I think, Ava said, standing slowly, you and I should keep talking somewhere with a few more people present. Petrosky didn't run, which surprised her less than it should have. Men caught this far inside a lie rarely had anywhere left to run to, not on a base surrounded by open desert with armed personnel at every gate. He sat in the same converted shipping container that had held Sokolov days earlier, and for the first hour he said almost nothing, the same patient silence Sokolov had offered, though with none of Sokolov's earned confidence behind it. It was Mallory who finally broke him, not through threat, but through a piece of information that landed harder than any threat could have. Praxis Continental's records show you requested transfer to this region specifically 11 weeks ago, Mallory said, sliding a printed personnel file across the table between them. 11 weeks ago is 2 weeks before the Tarsus reconnaissance run that established the pattern Sokolov's people exploited. You didn't stumble into this job, Petrosky. You requested it. Petrosky's composure finally, visibly cracked. I didn't know what it would become, he said, his voice low, scraped raw with something that sounded almost like genuine regret, though Ava had learned not to trust the sound of regret from a man caught with no other cards left to play. It started as logistics intel, movement patterns, resupply timing, money for information. That's all it was supposed to be. Nobody told me it would mean people getting taken, getting killed. Who's running it? Ava said. Not Praxis Continental as a company, the actual person who recruited you. I don't have a name. I have a contact, secure channel, instructions that come down through 3 layers before they reach me. He looked up, and for the first time, something like genuine fear showed through the calculation. But I know they're not finished. Corvell was supposed to be the next operation, and if you've already pulled that team back, they're going to know something's wrong. They're going to accelerate whatever else is planned, because a compromised operation means cutting losses fast before the trail leads back any further than it already has. What else is planned? I don't know specifics, but the volume of data that's moved through me in the last 2 months, it's not one operation. It's a pattern across this entire region. Multiple bases, multiple corridors. Whatever this actually is, Sentinel and Corvell are pieces of something a lot bigger. The tent went quiet, the weight of that settling over everyone present. Ren, who'd been listening from the corner with her arms crossed, finally spoke, her voice carrying the particular grim clarity of someone confirming a fear she'd been holding back from saying out loud. If this is regional in scope, we're not looking at a contractor selling information for profit. We're looking at an organized intelligence operation using a logistics company as cover across multiple installations. That's not Sokolov's contract anymore. That's somebody with resources and patience running something for much higher stakes. The next 12 hours became a race against an enemy that could no longer afford patience. With Petrovsky in custody and Corvell's element relocated, whoever ran the operation behind Praxis Continental's cover had to know their network was unraveling, and Ava had spent enough years around people who operated this way to understand exactly what came next. Not retreat. Consolidation, and one final attempt to salvage whatever could still be salvaged before the entire structure collapsed. That attempt came at 0340, when a perimeter alert at Sentinel's eastern gate pulled half the base out of bed and into defensive positions, weapons up, expecting the kind of direct assault that Sokolov's people had shown themselves capable of mounting. What came instead was stranger, and in its way more dangerous. A single vehicle, a Praxis Continental logistics truck with proper credentials, and a driver who matched every database check, requesting routine access for a scheduled fuel delivery that, when checked against the actual schedule, didn't exist. Hold position, Ava said over the commnet, watching the truck idle at the gate through a pair of borrowed binoculars, every instinct she had, screaming that something about the vehicle's stillness was wrong. Don't wave him through, don't turn him away yet. I want eyes on that cargo bed before anyone gets close to it. Mallory, beside her, lowered his own binoculars. You think it's a bomb? I think Petrovsky told us they'd accelerate, and a delivery truck with falsified credentials showing up at 0340 isn't a coincidence. She keyed the comm, her voice flat and controlled despite the cold certainty climbing her spine. Gate team, fall back 50 meters, now. Nobody approaches that vehicle on foot. The driver, watching the gate guards retreat instead of wave him through, made his decision in under 3 seconds, the truck's engine roaring as he threw it into reverse, tires tearing up gravel as he attempted to disengage and flee back into the dark desert beyond Sentinel's perimeter lights. He's running, someone shouted. Let him run, Ava called back. Don't engage the vehicle directly, just track him. If that truck is carrying what I think it's carrying, the last thing we want is small arms fire putting a round into it at close range. The truck made it 400 meters before a drone overhead, repositioned in seconds by Ren's team, caught the driver abandoning the vehicle entirely, sprinting on foot into broken terrain while the truck rolled to a stop, engine still running, abandoned. EOD took 90 careful minutes to confirm what Ava had already suspected. A substantial explosive charge wired into the cargo bed, sophisticated enough that detonation would have leveled the gate structure and likely a significant portion of the base's eastern perimeter, timed for an hour when foot traffic through that section would have been at its lowest, suggesting the goal wasn't maximum casualties, but maximum structural damage. A statement, not a massacre. A message that the operation behind Praxis Continental could still reach inside Sentinel's walls, even as its network collapsed around it. They're not trying to win anymore. Wren said quietly, watching the EOD team work under floodlights, her face pale in a way Ava hadn't seen since the crisis began. They're trying to make sure that even if we take them down, they take something with them. Bum. The driver who'd fled on foot was recovered 4 hours later, exhausted and dehydrated, picked up by a patrol working a search grid that fanned out from the abandoned truck. He wasn't Praxis Continental at all, it turned out, but a contracted asset with no formal employment record anywhere in the company's files. A ghost, paid in cash, deniable by design, exactly the kind of disposable operator an organization burns through when it needs deniability more than loyalty. He talked faster than Petrovsky had, faster than Sokolov ever would, the particular fast, desperate talking of a man who'd been hired for a single job and had never signed up for the kind of consequences now staring him down. "I don't know names," he said, over and over, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool morning air inside the interrogation tent. "I get instructions, I get paid. I don't ask who's paying me. That's the job." "Then tell us what you do know," Ava said, patient in the particular way that came from years of extracting information from people too frightened to organize their own thoughts. "Where did the instructions for tonight come from? How did you receive them?" "Dead drop. Coordinates, encrypted file, picked up 2 days ago." His hands were shaking. "There was a name on the payment routing, though. Wasn't supposed to see it, but I did, before I deleted the file like I was told to." Ava leaned forward. "What name?" "Halverson Group. Some kind of holding company, I think. That's all I saw. A payment routing through something called Halverson Group." The name meant nothing to Ava directly, but she watched Wren's face across the tent change in real time. The careful professional stillness cracking for just a moment into something that looked almost like recognition, almost like dread. "Wren, I need to make a call," Wren said, already moving toward the tent flap, her voice tight in a way it hadn't been even during the worst of the night's chaos. "Privately. Now." She was gone for nearly 40 minutes, and when she returned, her composure had been carefully rebuilt, though not perfectly enough to hide the tension still sitting in her shoulders. She gathered Ava, Mallory, and Roe into the command tent, the canvas flaps sealed, and laid a single printed document on the table between them. A corporate registration filing, dense with the particular bland language of shell company paperwork. "Halverson Group," she said, "is a holding company registered through 4 different jurisdictions, designed specifically to obscure its actual ownership. We've had analysts tracking entities like this for over a year, low priority, because the connections were thin and the activity was minimal. Until now." "What's the connection to Praxis Continental?" Mallory asked. "Halverson Group owns 40% of Praxis Continental, through 2 layers of shell entities that took our financial crimes people 6 months to untangle the last time anyone looked. Which means the logistics company running resupply through half the bases in this region isn't an independent contractor that got infiltrated. It's partially owned by the same organization that's been buying targeting data from inside it." The room absorbed that in heavy silence. "Who owns Halverson Group?" Ava asked, though something in her chest had already started to suspect the shape of the answer before Wren spoke it. "That's the part that took the call this long," Wren said. "Because the controlling interest traces back to a private security and intelligence brokerage that's done contract work for at least 3 different governments over the past decade, always through proxies, always with enough legal distance to survive scrutiny. The kind of organization that doesn't get caught because it's never technically the one holding the gun. It just arranges for someone else to be standing there when the trigger gets pulled. And Sokolov was almost certainly one of their contracted assets, the same as Petrovsky, the same as the driver we picked up tonight. Disposable layers built specifically to keep the actual organization insulated from exactly the kind of investigation we're now running." Wren's jaw tightened. "Which means everyone we've captured so far, everything we've uncovered, it's still not the real target. It's the outer skin of something considerably larger, and they just demonstrated tonight that they're willing to burn an entire truck and a fortune in cash to keep us from getting any closer to the center of it." Ava sat with that for a long moment, the weight of 3 days compressing into something that felt less like a single rescue mission and more like the edge of an iceberg she'd only just begun to see the shape of. "So what's the actual play here?" "We've rolled up Sokolov, Petrovsky, tonight's driver. Reyes is in custody. Every disposable asset they've used is gone or captured. What does an organization like that do when its outer layer collapses this fast? Ren's answer came slow, deliberate, each word chosen like she was already bracing for what saying it out loud would set in motion. Either it goes dark completely, buries itself so deep we lose the trail for years, or it makes one last move to recover what it's already lost, because an organization like this doesn't survive on patience alone. It survives on control. And right now, the people running Halverson Group know exactly what we have in custody, exactly what we're close to learning, and exactly where every piece of evidence connecting them to 4 years of operations is currently sitting. "Where is it sitting?" Mallory asked, though his face had already gone tight, like he'd guessed the answer a half-second before it arrived. "Here," Ren said quietly. "Sentinel. Sokolov in custody. Petrovsky in custody. The driver." The hard drives Briggs photographed before the fire took the rest. Every thread connecting Halverson Group to 4 years of operations across this region is currently sitting inside this base's perimeter, and we just told them, by capturing all of it, exactly how much they stand to lose if it survives long enough to reach a courtroom. The radio at Roe's hip crackled to life before anyone could respond, a perimeter watch officer's voice carrying a flat, controlled urgency that cut through the tent like a blade. "Command, this is Northwatch. We've got multiple unidentified vehicles approaching from the northern access road. No transponder signal, no advance notice on tonight's movement log. ETA to perimeter, 6 minutes. And command, thermals showing this isn't 6 men in a truck. This is a column." "A column," Mallory repeated, already moving toward the tent flap. "How many vehicles?" 8, command. Maybe 9. Spacing's tight. Formation's disciplined. This isn't a smash and grab." Ava was already running the math, the same cold clarity that had carried her through the desert 4 nights earlier, settling over her now like a second skin. "They're not here to extract anything." Ren said it herself. Every thread connecting Halverson Group to 4 years of operations is inside this perimeter. They're not coming to steal it back. "They're coming to erase it," Ren finished, her face gone pale under the tent's harsh light. "Sokolov, Petrovsky, the driver, the evidence, all of it. A column that size isn't planning to negotiate." Mallory was already keying his radio, voice snapping into the clipped cadence of a man falling back on 15 years of training because there was nothing else solid left to stand on. "All units, full alert, defensive posture, eastern and northern perimeter, reinforce immediately. This is not a drill." 5 minutes, Ava said, cutting through the rising noise of the camp scrambling to life around them. "We don't have time for a textbook defense. Captain, where's Sokolov being held? Where's Petrovsky? Where's the driver? Are they together or separated?" "Separated. Different containers, different ends of the compound. Standard protocol after the first capture." "Good. Consolidate them now, somewhere defensible. Because if this column has even basic intelligence on our layout, they're going to hit those positions first, and they're going to hit them hard." She was already moving, grabbing her kit, the same kit she'd packed and repacked every day since arriving at a base that was supposed to be nowhere, supposed to be nothing. "Roe, I need every spare weapon and every able body that isn't already on the perimeter line. We hold what we can hold." Roe didn't hesitate. "On it, set." The column hit the northern perimeter at 0351, headlights cut, moving fast and dark across open ground with the kind of coordinated discipline that confirmed everything Ren had warned them about. Not insurgents, not opportunists, a professional force paid well, briefed precisely, sent to finish what Sokolov's failure and Petrovsky's exposure had left undone. The first vehicle hit a hasty barrier Roe's team had thrown up in the last 4 minutes. A stack of supply crates and a parked Humvee angled to choke the access road, and the resulting collision bought Sentinel maybe 90 seconds of chaos that the defenders used better than the attackers expected. Gunfire erupted along the northern line, muzzle flashes strobing against the pre-dawn dark, and Ava found herself back in the only role that had ever made sense to her in moments like this. Not commanding from a tent, but moving through the fight itself, patching what could be patched, directing fire where it mattered most. "They're trying to split our attention," she shouted to Mallory over the roar of an exchange that had already grown louder than anything Sentinel had weathered in months. "Watch the eastern gate. If this is the main effort up north, somebody's coming through quiet on the other side." She was right. 3 minutes later, a second, smaller team breached the eastern perimeter fence in the chaos, moving fast and low toward the converted shipping containers, exactly where Sokolov and Petrovsky had been held before the consolidation order went out. They found empty containers and a defended position instead. Rowe's hastily assembled team dug in around the relocated prisoners, and the firefight that followed was close, ugly, and entirely without the clean lines of a textbook engagement. A round caught one of Rowe's people in the shoulder, spinning him hard into the dirt, and Ava was there within seconds, dragging him behind cover while return fire chewed through the air above them both. "Stay with me," she said, the same words she'd said to Briggs in the Kestrel Basin, the same words she'd say to anyone bleeding under her hands until the day she stopped doing this work entirely. "You're not done yet." "Wasn't planning on it," he gritted out, and she almost smiled, even with blood slicking her hands, even with the fight still raging 20 feet away. The eastern assault broke within 6 minutes, the attackers realizing too late that the position they'd expected to be lightly held had been reinforced, and they fell back toward their vehicles under covering fire, leaving 2 of their own on the ground. But the northern line was a different story, the main column pressing harder, and over the comm-net Mallory's voice carried the particular strain of a man watching a position he wasn't sure he could hold. "Whitmore, we're taking serious pressure up here. I've got 2 wounded and they're pushing the barrier." "I'm coming, Chad." She reached the northern line at a dead run, the fight there sharper and more sustained than anything at the eastern gate, muzzle flashes lighting the dark in a constant, ugly strobe. The barrier Rowe's team had improvised was holding, barely, but 2 SEALs lay wounded behind it, and a third defender's weapon had jammed at the worst possible moment, leaving a gap in the line that the attackers were already working to exploit. Ava dropped beside the nearest wounded man, assessing fast. Gut shot, serious, the kind of wound that needed surgical intervention she couldn't provide in the middle of a firefight. Only stabilize and pray the helicopter that wasn't coming for hours would somehow arrive sooner. She packed the wound, applied pressure, kept her voice steady even as rounds cracked past close enough to feel the air move. "Mallory, your left flank is thinning. They know it." "I see it. I don't have the bodies to cover it." "Then we change the math." She was already moving again, grabbing a rifle from a fallen position, the old instinct taking over completely now. The part of her that had spent 6 years doing exactly this kind of work in places that officially didn't exist. "Cover me." What she did next would become in the retelling that spread through Sentinel over the following weeks, the kind of story that grew taller with each version, though the truth, stripped of exaggeration, was dramatic enough on its own. She moved along the weak flank in short, controlled bursts, using the broken terrain the same way she'd used it approaching Sokolov's compound days earlier, putting down 2 attackers who'd worked their way close enough to threaten the barrier's collapse, buying just enough time for Rowe's team to shift and reinforce the gap. The column's commander, a broad-shouldered man directing the assault from behind the lead vehicle, visible now in the growing pre-dawn light, seemed to recognize, almost in real time, that the operation wasn't unfolding the way it had been planned. Professional soldiers didn't usually keep pressing an assault once the cost-benefit had visibly shifted against them, and Ava watched him make the calculation, watched the column begin a slow, disciplined withdrawal that was nothing like a retreat and everything like a tactical decision made by someone unwilling to lose more than the mission was worth. "They're pulling back," Mallory said, disbelief evident in his voice even as he kept his weapon trained on the retreating vehicles. "They're not finished," Ava said. "They're regrouping. This wasn't the full effort, Captain. This was them testing whether we'd actually hold." She was right again, though not in the way anyone expected. The column didn't return to finish what it had started. Instead, 20 minutes after the withdrawal began, a transmission came through Sentinel's open emergency channel, unencrypted, deliberately so, meant to be heard by anyone monitoring the frequency. "Sentinel Command, this is Halverson Group representative. You have something that belongs to us. 3 assets currently in your custody. We are prepared to negotiate their return in exchange for the cessation of any further investigation into our operations in this region. Failure to negotiate will result in consequences extending well beyond tonight's engagement." The tent went silent. Wren's face had gone hard, calculating, already 3 moves ahead. "They just confirmed everything," she said quietly. "An organization that doesn't exist legally, talking openly about negotiating for captured assets over an unencrypted channel, because they're desperate enough now to stop hiding. That's not strength. That's a wounded animal. Ava looked at her, then at Mallory, then at the radio still humming with the open channel waiting for a response. Then let's make sure it knows exactly how wounded it actually is. The response that went out 20 minutes later wasn't Mallory's voice, and it wasn't Wren's. It was Ava's, calm and measured, carrying across the open channel with the particular authority of someone who'd stopped being anyone's background noise the moment she walked alone into a hostile compound and walked back out with the commander still breathing. "This is Whitmore. Your assets aren't returning. Sokolov's talking. Petrovsky's talking. The driver you sent tonight to burn evidence is talking faster than either of them, and every word is being recorded by people with considerably more authority than either of us. You didn't lose 3 assets tonight. You lost the only leverage that was keeping your entire operation insulated. There's no negotiation here. There's just the time it takes for everything you've built to finish coming apart." Silence on the channel, stretching long enough that Ava wondered if the transmission had simply ended without response. Then finally, a voice, different from the first, older, carrying the particular cold patience of someone who'd survived a long career by never raising his voice even when everything was burning down around him. "You understand who you're speaking to?" "I understand exactly who I'm speaking to," Ava said. "A logistics broker hiding behind 4 jurisdictions and a shell company who just sent a column to attack a U.S. forward operating base because you were too frightened of what your own contractor might say to leave him in our custody. That's not power. That's panic wearing a nicer suit. You will regret this conversation." "I've had worse threats from better men," Ava said, and cut the channel. The federal response, when it finally arrived 2 days later, came with the particular overwhelming force that bureaucracy reserved for situations it could no longer pretend were small. A joint task force, drawn from 3 different agencies, descended on Sentinel with enough personnel and equipment to make the base feel, for the first time since Ava's arrival, genuinely crowded. Sokolov, Petrovsky, Reyes, and the driver were transferred under heavy guard to a secure facility for what would become, over the following months, one of the most extensive prosecutions the region had seen in years. A case built methodically from the testimony of disposable assets who'd finally understood that loyalty to an organization willing to burn them for convenience wasn't loyalty worth keeping. Halverson Group's actual leadership, 3 men and a woman, it turned out, operating out of offices in 2 different countries with the kind of legal insulation that had protected them for over a decade, were named in sealed indictments within 6 weeks. The financial trail Wren's team had spent a year slowly accumulating, suddenly accelerated by the volume of evidence Sentinel's defenders had forced into the open. None of it happened cleanly. 2 of the 4 would never see the inside of a courtroom, vanishing into jurisdictions with no extradition agreements. The particular bitter compromise that came with operations this large and this well-funded. But 2 did stand trial. Eventually, the public unraveling of an organization that had spent 4 years believing itself untouchable. Commander Hale, recovering steadily under proper medical care, 3 weeks removed from a compound he'd been certain he wouldn't survive, sat with Ava in the aid station on the morning the federal task force prepared to leave, watching the last of their vehicles being loaded outside. "They're calling it the most significant regional intelligence operation broken up in 5 years, he said, his voice still rough, but steadily regaining its old strength. "You know that, right? What you started just by refusing to let it go." "I didn't start it alone." "No, but you're the reason anyone took it seriously enough to follow it all the way to the end." He shifted, wincing slightly at the movement of healing ribs, and reached into his jacket, producing a small, worn coin that caught the morning light. "I want you to have this." She took it carefully, a challenge coin, the kind operators carried as a private, unofficial marker of debt and respect, the metal worn smooth from years in his pocket. "Commander, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." His eyes held hers, steady despite everything his body had been through. "You walked into a place most operators wouldn't have walked into, alone, on nothing but your own judgment, because everyone above you had decided the bureaucracy mattered more than the clock. That's not something I forget. That's not something this base forgets either, whatever the official paperwork ends up saying about who gets credit." She closed her hand around the coin, the weight of it settling into her palm like something she'd carry for a long time. "Thank you." Thank you, he said simply, for not being just a nurse, even when every single one of us decided that's all you were. Song. Captain Mallory found her later that same day, near the perimeter fence where she'd first watched the desert swallow Hale's team weeks earlier, the same stretch of horizon that had once represented nothing but failure, now holding something closer to resolution. Command's offering you a citation, he said. Formal recognition, public ceremony, the works. I'm declining it. He wasn't surprised, exactly, but something in his expression shifted, curious. Most people wouldn't. Most people's work doesn't depend on staying quiet enough to do it again. She looked out at the desert, the light catching the broken ground where so much had nearly gone wrong. Whatever I did here, Captain, it only worked because nobody expected it from me. The moment that changes, the moment my face is attached to a headline, that usefulness disappears. I'd rather keep doing the work than keep the credit for it. Mallory absorbed that, nodding slowly, like a man finally understanding something he'd been circling for weeks. For what it's worth, I already submitted the after-action report. I didn't soften anything. Every dismissal, every time I told you to stay in your lane while you were the only one reading the situation correctly, it's all in there. Not because anyone made me write it that way, because it's the truth, and you earned having it written down somewhere, even if nobody outside this base ever reads it. That matters more than a ceremony would have. I figured. He extended a hand and she shook it, the gesture carrying a different weight than it had 3 weeks earlier, when he'd greeted her off the transport without bothering to learn anything beyond what her file said. I was wrong about you for 3 weeks straight, Whitmore. I don't plan on making that mistake with the next person who walks into this base looking quiet and unremarkable. Good, she said, because the next person might not have the patience I did. Donnelly caught her on her last morning at Sentinel, his arms still in a sling but his color returned, his eyes carrying less of the hollow weight they'd held in the days after the rescue. He didn't say much, just stood with her for a while near the helicopter pad, watching the ground crew prep her transport, the same kind of transport that had carried her into this base as someone nobody bothered to notice. Petrov's wife wrote to the unit, he said finally, asked if anyone could tell her how he died, whether he suffered. Ava was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with the same care she gave to every difficult truth she'd ever had to deliver. Tell her he didn't break. Tell her that mattered, in a place built specifically to make men break. That's not nothing, Donnelly. For a 5-year-old who's going to grow up knowing his father died doing something that mattered, that's not nothing at all. Donnelly nodded, swallowing hard, and didn't trust himself to say anything else. The helicopter's rotors began their slow spin-up, kicking dust across the pad, and Roe appeared at her side as she shouldered her duffel bag, the same duffel she'd carried off the transport weeks earlier, though she carried it differently now, the weight of it somehow lighter, despite everything that had happened. Where to next, he asked. Wherever they send me. That's usually how it works. Oh, you ever think about staying somewhere long enough for people to actually know you before something blows up? She considered the question, watching the desert stretch out toward a horizon that had nearly cost her everything and had instead given her back something she hadn't realized she'd lost, the simple, unglamorous satisfaction of being seen clearly, even briefly, by people who'd finally bothered to look. Maybe someday. For now, there's always somewhere else that needs someone willing to do the looking nobody else wants to do. That's a hell of a way to live. It's the only way I've ever known how. He extended a hand and she took it, the grip firm and certain in a way that felt like the closing of something honest. Take care of yourself, Whitmore. You too, Caleb. The helicopter lifted away from Sentinel as the sun climbed fully over the horizon, the base shrinking below into a scatter of reinforced containers and patched fencing that looked, from this height, like nothing more than what it had always pretended to be, a quiet, unremarkable outpost where nothing important was supposed to happen. Ava watched it fade, the challenge coin warm in her closed fist, and thought about everything the last 3 weeks had taken and given in equal measure. A man she'd never met alive, buried in the desert's memory, now alongside too many others. A commander who'd looked at her differently in the end than he had on the first day. A captain who'd learned, the hard way, that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one actually paying attention. She thought about every base before this one, Every operation that had asked her to disappear into the background until the moment someone needed exactly what she'd spent a lifetime becoming. The world would keep underestimating people like her. That part never changed, no matter how many times the truth eventually surfaced. What changed each time was her own certainty about what that underestimation actually cost the people who indulged in it, and what it gave her in return: the freedom to move unseen until the moment unseen stopped being useful to anyone but herself. Somewhere out past the curve of the earth, another base was waking up to another ordinary morning, full of people who would, in time, learn the same lesson Sentinel had learned: that the person nobody bothers to notice is sometimes the only one standing between an ordinary day and a catastrophe. That quiet competence outlasts loud confidence every single time it's actually tested. That being underestimated wasn't a wound to carry. It was, if you let it be, the sharpest tool you'd ever own. The horizon swallowed Sentinel completely, and Ava Whitmore closed her eyes, the challenge coin still warm in her palm, already thinking less about what she was leaving behind than about who, somewhere ahead, was waiting to be saved by someone they hadn't yet learned to see.